was an agricultural settlement in North Florida before the Mexican and Civil Wars. It was one of the first towns in territorial Florida. Crops included leaf tobacco, whose seed was brought in 1829 from Virginia. After the Civil War, Quincy was a poor rural town like most in the South. But in 1890, it was discovered that the soil was perfect for growing wrapper tobacco in the shade for cigars. Outside money arrived to put it to use. Quincy had good land, workers, and now capital.
In the film that we have here, there's several shots of my dad. He's the large man, he's kind of bald. He's quite often wearing a cooter shell hat, one of those African safari kind of hats. He's standing in a seed bed, tobacco seed bed. And one of the interesting things that they did, and I don't know why, some of you other people you interview maybe can answer this question, but he liked to go to new ground and clear out an acre in the woods on a reasonably flat hillside, and would make these, it would be usually rectangle in shape if it was the easiest structure to build. Quite often you see a stump or two out in the field because they couldn't get the stump up. And they would make these long strip beds in the dirt. And they cultivated to the point that the sand was real fine. And they would take these tobacco seeds and mix them with something that was lighter than the seed so the seed would adhere, because the seeds are very, very small.
Along about November or December, you started preparing the ground, and along about the 1st of January, you planted a seed bed, and went on preparing the shades. And along about February, you started putting cloth up, and along about the middle of March, the plants in the seed bed were big enough to transplant. That was usually finished maybe the first week in April. And then the plants grew, and you usually gathered your first leaves from the bottom, 20th, 21st, 22nd of May, somewhere in there. And you usually finished your harvest by toward the end of June, sometimes a little longer, depending. I mean, your weather was never the same. The tobacco was harvested and was strung up, hung up in the barns to cure from green to brown. And that usually took about 30 days. Well, if you started gathering your first tobacco May the 21st, usually by June 21st, your very first tobacco is ready to go to the warehouse. Eventually, it all got in, maybe latter part of July. Along about maybe the first couple of weeks in August, the first that you had gotten in was ready to start to sort. And depending on what your sales agreement was, you sorted it either leaf by leaf, or you sorted it right in the string that it was originally tied up in, merely pulling out the leaves that didn't pass for first quality. And we'd have 80 or 100 women in a building doing that. And after it had been sorted, however it had to be done, it was put back in bulk to ferment a little more. It had to be turned every 10 days or so. We had thermometers in the bulk, and if it was a little too moist, it might get a little too hot, and you'd have to turn it sooner than that. Eventually, it would dry out to the point where it could be baled, and that usually started maybe October, end of September, somewhere in there. Well, by the time you had everything baled, it might be sometime in December. So tobacco had to be in a bale about 30 days before you could sample that bale. The process was that you had sold various grades before then, subject to what the bale samples turned out. So by the time everything in a certain grade was ready, you had your buyer come in, and you opened each bale a little bit, and you pulled a couple of hands, which might be 50 or 60 leaves out, and according to that sample, it was either accepted or not.
At its peak in the 1960s, 300 farming operations grew 6,000 acres of shade tobacco each year. Each acre of tobacco was sold to cigar manufacturers and dealers for about $4,000, more than the cost of a new car. Some of these operations involved several farms totaling over 500 acres, employing many hundreds of people. Some were as small as 1 acre, employing 2 or 3. Most growers were white, some were black. In all the operations, the tobacco was grown, graded, packed, and sold here. All of our children helped on the farms when school was out. Most of the same people who worked in the fields worked in the processing. Shade tobacco also required careful handwork.
60 years ago, if you didn't have a little shade tobacco, you couldn't make it in Gadsden County. And he was right. In reality, I guess you got to have a specialized crop, which would, right now they're growing some tomatoes and nursery stock. It's comparatively, you got to have a high income on a few acres. You can't imagine when you see a tobacco plant what a small seed it came from. In other words, you used to make figure a plant bed, you figure to put, before we really got into good irrigation systems, that you'd put an ounce of seed to 100 square yards. A long time ago, you went in there with a plow and ripped the row open, and you put your fertilizer in there, including stable manure. And then you took a turning plow with a mule and come back and made 2 rounds on that row, which threw dirt on it 2 sides. That was 3 to 4 weeks before you set out tobacco. If you waited after, you had to let that fertilizer go through the heat. If it didn't, it'd burn that plant when you set it out. Well, then when you got ready to set tobacco, you went there and those turning plows and turn that dirt back, and it would leave a little ridge right in the middle. And then you take a straight stalk, a pry stalk, we call them, and had a shovel on it. You went in there and it split that, broke that center up, fluffed it up, and then you took that little dry stalk with that thing on and lifted back, made a little row that, I don't know, probably 14, 16 inches wide, and you raked it off, flattened it off, and dropped that plant on there, which you put somewhere between 10 and 12,000 plants per acre. Finally, it got to the point where you kind of went on time. 6 to 7 weeks old. But you could just look at it if you were a tobacco farm and tell it needed to be primed. When that plant got up 10 or 12 inches high, you'd have to put a string on it and tie it. You had what's called a row wire. You had a wire that went over every row, and you had to put a string around it, make a loop around that, and tie it to that wire. And that was a job. You just imagine a woman that she had to go down and loop that string and then pull it up and hand it to somebody on the bench to tie it to the row wire. And it's what they call a taff back then was a good loop would loop 3/4 acres a day. Well, if we had 12,000 plants to the row that she done 3/4, that was 8,000 times she had to bend over and pick up. And that was bad going, but it was hard work. But that was probably one of the hardest jobs it was looping tobacco.
The first job I got, I was too small to lug tobacco, and the man, Charlie Wells, give me a job watching the turkeys to find the nests, when And the next year, I was able to be a lugger from a primer to take tobacco out of his hand to carry it to the end to a packer where they was putting it on the barge. And I tried to be progressive in it. And to see the primer had to carry one side of the row up and bring the other one back between two rows. And me and Alice Stokes and Marie Crooms, we was luggers, and when our primer got to the end going up, we had the row almost to the end what he had to bring back. And Mr. Charlie asked us, say, do y'all think y'all could carry a row? And we told him yes. But we was getting luggers' wages. And he said, well, if you all can carry a row, I pay you grown folks' salary, which was 50 cents a day. And we started the priming. We had a lugger, but we were small, and we carried a row, and we, instead of making 25 cents, we made 50.
I don't know of anybody that ever worked in a tobacco field that wanted to go back out there and work another day. I've done the hardest day's work in my life. I have red hair and fair skin. I couldn't handle the sun. It's dirty work. You walk out in the fields and on a wet, dewy morning, and the tobacco plant exudes a sticky residue. It drips off on the weeds that are on the side, and they stick to your clothes, and your legs are, your clothing is sticky and clammy and hot and steamy. It's hard work. Nobody really wants to do it if they don't have to.
It was what you did, what you had to do to survive. I mean, it was a job. If we had lived in Miami, you know, they might have worked in some of the hotels, you know, but we lived here, so tobacco was the industry.
The only way that I could progress was to learn how to brook tobacco. And I learned how to brook tobacco. Every time I got a chance, I'd get there and try to run a rim around it. And I was successful in that, and they elevated me from toting tobacco to booking it. And from booking it to baling it, and sewing around the press. And Mr. Weinberg, he saw that I was trying my best to reach the top, and so he put me over the ties in the sorting room, where I sized and tied tobacco for it to be baled.
Unfortunately, in the 1970s, tobacco from Quincy was no longer in demand. There are many substitutes. Now there is no shade tobacco grown here. Many former tobacco growers and their children grow tomatoes and nursery plants where tobacco used to be, or work in government jobs. The Florida and Georgia shade tobacco industry is now gone. It is part of Florida and Georgia history.